The candle by the Dowager Duchess's bed went out twice before the doctor arrived, and both times Duke Alden Whitmore lit it himself, refusing to call a servant, refusing to leave the room even for a moment. His mother, Constance, lay pale against the pillows, her breathing shallow, her hand gripping his wrist with a strength that frightened him more than her illness did. "Promise me," she said, "before the doctor comes, before anyone else speaks to me tonight." "Anything," Alden said, and meant it, though he had learned over the years that his mother's requests were rarely simple. "Find a wife," Constance said, "not a title, not a fortune, someone who is your equal, someone who will not bow to the name Whitmore, but stand beside it. I want to see it before I close my eyes for good." Alden's throat tightened. He was 34, unmarried, and had spent the last 10 years running the estate his father left in ruins, chasing away creditors, with paperwork and patience, while his cousin Gerald circled the family like a hawk waiting for a rabbit to tire. Marriage had never been the urgent thing. Now, suddenly, it was the only thing. "I will find her," he said. "I swear it." Constance's grip loosened, not because she had given up, but because she believed him, and belief, in her condition, took less effort than fear. The doctor arrived an hour later and confirmed what the household already suspected. The Dowager Duchess's heart was failing, slowly, unevenly, with no clear number of months or weeks attached to the verdict. She might have a year, she might have far less. Nobody could say, and the not knowing was its own kind of torment, hanging over Ashcombe Hall like smoke that would not clear. Alden did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with a single lamp burning and a list in front of him. A list his mother had begun weeks earlier without telling him. 6 names of women from families she considered suitable, written in her careful, slanting hand. Lady Cordelia Vane, Lady Beatrice Hollis, Lady Frances Grey. 3 more beneath them, names attached to counties, attached to fathers with old titles and older debts of their own. He did not want to marry a stranger from a list. But he had promised, and a Whitmore promise, whatever else the name had lost over the generations, still meant something to the man who carried it. By morning, he had given the order to his valet, Edmund Price, to prepare the carriage. 3 counties, 6 names. No time to waste, and a cousin waiting in London who would be delighted to hear the Duke had failed to secure his line before the old Duchess died. Gerald Whitmore had made no secret of his ambitions. He visited Ashcombe twice a year, always when least welcome, always asking after Alden's health with a concern too polished to be real. If Alden died without an heir, or without a marriage that satisfied the strict terms of the old entail, the title and what remained of the estate would pass sideways to Gerald's branch of the family, a branch that had already sold off 2 country houses and gambled away a third. Alden did not fear for himself. He feared for the tenants, the servants, the people whose lives were tied to Ashcombe whether they liked it or not. The carriage left before noon. The first county brought him to the Vane estate, a handsome house with too many windows and not enough warmth in any of the rooms behind them. Lady Cordelia was exactly as advertised, poised, lovely in the practiced way of a woman raised to be looked at, and utterly unremarkable in conversation. She spoke of the weather, of a ball she had attended in London, of a bonnet she had seen in a shop window that she simply had to have. Alden danced with her once, out of politeness, and felt nothing stir in him but a dull, familiar tiredness. He left the Vane estate the same afternoon, apologizing for the shortness of his visit, and Lady Cordelia did not seem especially wounded by his departure. If anything, she looked relieved to return to her needlework. The road out of the county was narrow and rutted from recent rain, and halfway along it the carriage lurched hard to the right, the whole frame groaning, and Edmund shouted for the driver to stop before the wheel gave out entirely. It gave out anyway. The carriage tilted, wood cracked, and Alden was thrown against the door with enough force to knock the breath from him. When he climbed out, boots sinking into mud, he found the front wheel split clean through, the axle bent at an angle that promised hours of delay. A woman appeared from the stone house nearby before Edmund had even finished swearing at the wreckage. She came at a run, skirts gathered in one fist, flour dusted white across her sleeve as if she had been pulled straight from her kitchen. She did not ask if anyone was hurt first. She went straight to the wheel, crouched beside it, and ran her fingers along the crack with the calm assessment of someone who had fixed far worse things with far fewer resources. "You won't get another mile on this," she said, not looking up. "The axle's bent, not just the wheel. You'll need a smith, not a wheelwright, if you want it done properly." "You know a great deal about carriage wheels," Alden said, still catching his breath. "I know a great deal about things breaking," she said, and finally looked up at him. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, without a trace of the deference he was used to receiving the moment his title became known. "There's a smith 2 miles down the lane. I can send my father's boy to fetch him, if you don't mind waiting." "I don't mind waiting," Alden said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, daughter of the local vicar, Reverend Charles Marsh, and she did not curtsy when Alden finally introduced himself as the Duke of Ashcombe. She simply nodded, as though the information were interesting but not especially useful, and invited him inside out of the rain while the smith was sent for. The vicarage was small, warm, and smelled of bread and beeswax. Eleanor moved through it with the easy authority of someone who ran the household herself, setting tea before Alden without asking whether he wanted it, correcting Edmund's manners with a raised eyebrow when he tried to sit before the Duke did. "You run this house alone?" Alden asked. "My father tends to the parish." "I tend to everything else," Eleanor said. "The sick, the accounts, the roof when it leaks, which is often. I don't have time to be delicate about it." "You don't seem the delicate sort," Alden said, and something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that he felt oddly pleased with himself. The smith took 4 hours to arrive and repair the wheel properly, and Alden spent every one of those hours in the vicarage kitchen, watching Eleanor knead bread with more focus than most women gave to embroidery, listening to her speak of the families in the parish who needed medicine they could not afford, of a widow 3 houses down who had lost her husband to a fever the winter before, of a farmer's son with a broken leg that had healed crooked because no proper doctor had set it in time. She spoke of these things not with pity, which Alden had heard plenty of from society ladies performing concern at dinner parties, but with a kind of quiet fury, as though every unnecessary suffering in her parish were a personal insult she intended to correct. He left that evening with a repaired wheel and no clear reason to return. He invented one within 3 days. A letter that needed delivering to the vicar personally, though any messenger could have carried it. A horse that needed rest at the very inn nearest the vicarage, though the animal was perfectly capable of another hour's travel. Alden told himself these were reasonable excuses. He knew, even as he told himself this, that he was lying. Eleanor did not pretend to believe the excuses either. The 3rd time he appeared at the vicarage door, she opened it before he had finished knocking and said, "You don't need to invent reasons, Your Grace. You could simply say you wanted to visit." Alden felt his face grow warm in a way he had not experienced since he was a young man, long before debts and titles had taught him to keep his expressions carefully guarded. "I wanted to visit," he admitted. "Good," Eleanor said. "Now come in before you let all the heat out." Over the following days, Alden found himself telling her things he had not told anyone, not even his mother. He spoke of the debts his father had left behind, hidden for years behind a good coat and a confident smile. He spoke of Gerald, circling like a bird waiting for carrion, and of the strange, exhausting weight of holding a title together with nothing but stubbornness and unpaid bills. Eleanor listened without flinching, without the practiced sympathy of a woman hoping to secure a duke, and when she finally spoke, her words were not comfort but challenge. "Then stop holding it together alone," she said. "Find people who will hold it with you." "Is that an offer?" Alden asked, before he could stop himself. Eleanor's eyebrows lifted. "That depends entirely on what you're asking, Your Grace." He did not answer, not yet, because he did not trust himself to say the right thing, and some part of him understood, with a clarity that felt almost frightening, that whatever answer he gave would matter more than any promise he had made his dying mother. He left the vicarage that evening with the 2 remaining counties still unvisited on his mother's list, and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that visiting them would be a waste of everyone's time. Lady Beatrice Hollis lived in the 2nd county on a grand estate surrounded by hedges cut into unnatural, perfect shapes, and she greeted Alden with a smile that had clearly been practiced in front of a mirror many times before he arrived. She was witty in the way that required an audience, quick with a clever remark, but slower to notice whether anyone actually laughed. Alden sat through dinner, danced the required dance, and left the following morning with a headache and a growing sense that his mother's list, however well-intentioned, had been built on the wrong measurements entirely. Lady Frances Grey, in the 3rd county, was kinder than Lady Beatrice, gentler in her manner, and asked Alden thoughtful questions about the estate and the tenants that suggested a genuine, if untested, capacity for care. He almost convinced himself, for the better part of an afternoon, that she might do. She was not unkind, she was not foolish, she simply was not Eleanor, and once Alden noticed the absence, he could not stop noticing it, the way a missing tooth draws the tongue back again and again, no matter how firmly one tries to ignore it. He wrote to his mother that evening from the inn nearest Lady Frances's estate, choosing his words with the same care he gave to legal contracts. "Mother," he wrote, "I have visited 5 of the 6 names on your list, and I have found nothing in any of them that I did not already carry with me before I left Ashcombe. I believe I have found someone who answers your true question, though she is not on the list you gave me. I ask only that you trust me a little longer before you judge the answer." The reply came faster than he expected, carried by a rider who had clearly been given strict instructions to ride through the night if necessary. Constance's handwriting was weaker than it had been even a week earlier, the letters trembling slightly where they had once been sharp and certain, but the message itself was unmistakably his mother. "Come home, Alden. Bring her if she will come. I would like to see the answer to my question before I run out of time to see anything at all." Alden folded the letter twice and pressed it flat against his chest for a moment longer than necessary, as though the paper itself might steady the sudden unsteadiness in his own hands. He gave the order to turn the carriage back toward Eleanor's county that same night. He arrived at the vicarage the following afternoon, mud still splattered across the carriage wheels from the fast, careless pace he had set, and found Eleanor in the small garden behind the house, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up, pulling weeds from around a row of herbs with the same focused determination she brought to everything else. "You've returned quickly," she said, without looking up. "Did the other counties disappoint you, or did you simply forget something here?" "Both, in a manner of speaking," Alden said. "My mother is dying, Eleanor. Not soon, perhaps, or perhaps very soon indeed. Nobody can say. She asked me to find a wife who is my equal before she loses the chance to see it. I have visited 6 women on a list she wrote herself, and none of them are you, and I find I cannot pretend that doesn't matter." Eleanor sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron, and studied him with an expression that gave away nothing at all, which frightened Alden more than outright rejection would have. "You want to bring me to your mother," she said slowly, "as though I am the answer to a question I never agreed to be asked." "That isn't what I meant," Alden said, though even as he said it, he understood how it must have sounded to her. A duke arriving with mud on his boots, and a dying mother's ultimatum in his pocket, expecting a vicar's daughter to simply fall into step beside him because the timing suited his family's needs. "Then tell me what you did mean," Eleanor said, "and choose your words as though they matter, because I am not a name on a list you can cross off once you've decided I'll do." Alden knelt in the dirt beside her, ruining his coat in a way that would have horrified his valet, and spoke without the careful, practiced language he used in every other part of his life. "I meant that I have spent 10 years holding an estate together with nothing but stubbornness, and I have never once, in all that time, wanted someone to share the weight of it until I met you. I did not come back because my mother asked me to find someone. I came back because I could not stop thinking about you, and I would have come back even if my mother had never said a word about equals or estates or dying wishes at all." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Alden began to fear he had said too much, or not enough, or the wrong thing entirely. Then she said, "My father has been offered a larger parish in the north, a better living, better pay, a proper house instead of this leaking one. He has not accepted yet because he worries about leaving the families here without care. If I go with you to Ashcombe, even just to visit your mother, people will talk. They will say I chased a title. They will say things about my father's ambition that are not true and were never true." "Let them talk," Alden said. "I am not asking you to marry me tonight, Eleanor. I am asking you to come and meet a woman who is running out of time to meet the person her son has fallen for. What happens after that is entirely yours to decide, and I will accept whatever you decide, even if it means riding back to Ashcombe alone." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, weighing something Alden could not see, and then rose, brushing the dirt from her skirts with brisk, practical movements. "I will need to speak with my father first," she said, "and I will need 3 days to see to the families who depend on me before I can leave, even for a short visit. I will not abandon my responsibilities for a duke's convenience, no matter how urgent his mother's illness." 3 days, Alden agreed, and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time since the candle had gone out beside his mother's bed. Reverend Marsh, when consulted that evening, proved sharper and more perceptive than his gentle manner suggested. He studied Alden across the vicarage table with the calm, patient scrutiny of a man who had spent decades reading the truth beneath people's carefully arranged faces. "My daughter has turned away 3 suitors in the past 2 years, Your Grace," the vicar said. "Not because she lacked offers, but because none of them offered anything worth accepting. If she goes with you, it will not be for your title, it will be despite it. I trust you understand the difference, and I trust you will treat that difference with the respect it deserves." "I understand it better than you might think," Alden said. "I have spent my whole life being valued for a name I did not choose and debts I did not create. I would not wish that same fate on the one person who has ever looked at me and seen something else entirely." The vicar studied him a moment longer, then nodded, slowly, as though some private test had been passed. "Then take care of her," he said, "and take care of yourself as well, for I suspect you have spent so long carrying your family's burdens that you have forgotten how to set any of them down." 3 days later, Eleanor climbed into Alden's carriage with a single traveling case and a look of quiet, unshakable determination, the kind of look Alden had come to associate entirely with her, and entirely with no one else he had ever met. As the carriage pulled away from the vicarage, she glanced back once at the small stone house, at her father waving from the doorway, and then turned forward, facing the road ahead without a trace of regret in her expression. "If your cousin Gerald is half as ambitious as you've described him," Eleanor said, "he will not welcome me kindly." "No," Alden admitted, "he will not." "Good," Eleanor said, and there was something fierce and bright in her voice that made Alden laugh for the first time in longer than he could easily remember. "I've never much cared for people who welcome me kindly for the wrong reasons. I'd rather earn honest hostility than false warmth." They traveled through the night, changing horses twice, and Alden found himself watching Eleanor as she slept against the carriage window, exhausted from days of frantic preparation and farewells, her face finally unguarded in a way it rarely was while she was awake. He thought, watching her, that his mother had asked him to find someone who was his equal, and he understood now, with a clarity that felt almost overwhelming, that Constance had never meant equal in rank or fortune at all. She had meant equal in the way that mattered, someone who would not be diminished by the name Whitmore, someone who would carry it forward rather than be carried by it. Whether Gerald Whitmore would understand the same distinction remained an entirely separate and far more dangerous question, and Alden suspected he would not have long to wait before finding out the answer. Ashcombe Hall rose out of the morning mist like something half-remembered, gray stone and tall windows, and Eleanor sat forward in her seat the moment it came into view, studying it with the same careful, assessing look she had given the broken carriage wheel days before, as though she were already calculating what needed mending. "It's larger than I imagined," she said. "It's colder than it looks, too," Alden said. "Most of the rooms haven't been properly heated in years. We save the coal for the rooms my mother actually uses." "Then we'll start there," Eleanor said, and Alden did not ask what she meant by "we," though the word settled into his chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with coal. The housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, met them at the door with a face carefully arranged into polite neutrality, though her eyes moved over Eleanor's plain traveling dress with an assessment of her own. "Her Grace has been asking after you every hour, Your Grace," she said to Alden. "She is weaker than when you left, but her mind is sharp as ever. She insisted on being helped into a chair rather than receiving you in bed." "That sounds like her," Alden said, and led Eleanor up the wide staircase, his hand hovering near her elbow, not quite touching, as though he were afraid that touching her now, in this house, would somehow change the fragile thing growing between them. Constance sat propped in a chair by the window, a blanket over her knees despite the mild morning, her face thinner than Alden remembered from just over a week earlier, though her eyes, when they landed on Eleanor, sharpened with an intensity that belonged to a much healthier woman. "So," Constance said, "this is the one who is not on my list." "Eleanor Marsh," Alden said, "daughter of Reverend Charles Marsh." "I know whose daughter she is," Constance said, not unkindly. "I asked my son to describe you in his letter, and he failed entirely, which tells me more than any description could have. Come closer, girl. My eyes are not what they were, and I would like to see you properly before I decide anything." Eleanor crossed the room without hesitation, without the nervous, mincing steps Alden had seen other young women adopt in his mother's presence, and stood directly before the chair, meeting Constance's gaze without flinching. "You do not curtsy," Constance observed. "I did not think you wanted flattery, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "You wanted to see me properly, as you said. I thought a curtsy might get in the way of that." Something flickered across Constance's face, an expression Alden recognized from childhood, the particular look his mother wore when something had genuinely surprised her, which happened rarely enough that he had learned to treasure it. "Sit," Constance said, gesturing to the chair opposite her own. "Tell me about your father's parish. Tell me about the families you tend. My son's letter mentioned a widow and a farmer's son with a crooked leg, though he offered no details, being a man and therefore useless at noticing the things that actually matter." Eleanor sat, and for the better part of an hour, Alden watched his mother and the vicar's daughter speak as though he were not in the room at all, Constance asking sharp, probing questions about parish finances and medical care and the particular difficulties of managing a household with limited funds, and Eleanor answering each one with the same blunt, practical honesty she had shown Alden from the very first afternoon, never softening her answers to seem more impressive, never pretending to knowledge she did not have. "You have run that vicarage as though it were an estate of its own," Constance said finally, "with less money and more competence than half the great houses in this county manage with considerably more resources." "I had very little choice, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "My mother died when I was 12. Someone had to learn quickly, or the household would have fallen apart around us." The words came out plain, unadorned, without any invitation for pity, and Constance nodded slowly, as though this single sentence had answered every question she had intended to ask. "My son tells me you are his equal," Constance said. "I confess I did not know, when I gave him that instruction, precisely what I meant by it. I only knew I did not want him married to someone who would fold beneath the weight of this family's troubles, as I very nearly did myself, many years ago, before I learned to stop folding." She paused, studying Eleanor with an expression that had softened considerably from the sharp assessment of an hour earlier. "I believe I understand now what I meant. Welcome to Ashcombe, Eleanor Marsh." Alden felt something unclench in his chest, some tension he had been carrying since the candle first went out beside his mother's bed, but the relief lasted only as long as it took for the study door to open without a knock, and for Gerald Whitmore to step inside with the easy, confident stride of a man who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere. "Forgive the interruption," Gerald said, though his tone suggested no real apology at all. I heard the Duke had returned with a guest, and I confess my curiosity got the better of my manners. Alden rose immediately, placing himself half a step in front of Eleanor without quite deciding to do so, an instinct rather than a plan. Gerald, I did not expect you at Ashcombe. No, I imagine you did not, Gerald said, his eyes moving over Eleanor with a slow, cataloging attention that made Alden's jaw tighten. Word travels quickly, cousin, even in the country. A duke touring 3 counties in search of a bride tends to attract notice, and when he returns, not with any of the names society expected, but with a vicar's daughter instead, well, notice becomes something closer to conversation. Then let the conversation include the fact that I am marrying whom I choose, Alden said, and that neither you nor society has any say in the matter. Of course, Gerald said, spreading his hands in a gesture of easy surrender that fooled no one in the room. I only wonder whether the entail will see it quite so simply. The old terms were written with particular care, cousin. A marriage must be seen as suitable to the dignity of the title, or the succession may be challenged. I would hate to see you tangled in legal difficulties during a time already so burdened with your mother's health. The threat, wrapped in false concern, landed exactly as Gerald intended, and Alden felt the old, familiar exhaustion of dealing with his cousin settle over him, the sense of fighting a battle on ground that had been chosen entirely by the enemy. The entail requires a marriage of good character and lawful standing, Constance said from her chair, her voice weaker than usual, but no less sharp for it. It does not require a title of equal rank, Gerald, whatever you may wish it said. I read those terms myself, many years ago, when your father first began making similar noises about my own marriage. They did not work for him then, and they will not work for you now. Gerald's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes did, a brief flicker of recalculation. I only wish to see the family's interests protected, Aunt. I would hate for sentiment to override sound judgment during such a delicate time. The only delicate thing in this room, Constance said, is your own patience, which appears to be wearing thin rather quickly for a man who claims no personal stake in this matter. You may see yourself out, Gerald. I find I am tired, and I would like to finish my conversation with Eleanor without further interruption. Gerald bowed, more stiffly than he had entered, and left the room without another word, though the look he cast toward Eleanor on his way out carried a coldness that made Alden's hand tighten involuntarily at his side. He will not simply accept this, Alden said, once the door had closed. No, Constance agreed. He will not. Men like Gerald never accept anything freely given to someone else. You must be prepared for him to search for any weakness, any technicality, any rumor he can twist into a legal difficulty. What sort of technicality? Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the tension still hanging in the room. I do not know yet, Constance admitted, but I suspect we will find out sooner rather than later. They found out within the week. Gerald had ridden to London within a day of the confrontation, and returned 5 days later with a solicitor in tow, a thin, precise man named Mr. Farrow, who spoke in careful legal phrases and carried a leather case full of documents that he clearly relished producing at the most uncomfortable possible moment. The moment arrived over dinner, with Constance seated at the head of the table despite her weakness, insisting she would not be excluded from any conversation concerning her son's future. The entail, Mr. Farrow explained, laying a document beside Alden's plate with the careful precision of a man placing a winning card, specifies that any marriage must not bring the family name into disrepute, nor connect it to persons of questionable moral standing. I have taken the liberty of investigating Miss Marsh's family history, as is only prudent given the significance of the succession. And what have you found? Alden asked, his voice tight. Miss Marsh's mother, Farrow said, consulting his papers with theatrical slowness, was born to a family with certain financial irregularities in their past. A grandfather who spent time in a debtor's prison, if my sources are accurate. Hardly a scandal of the first order, but combined with Miss Marsh's own lack of fortune or title, one could construct a reasonable argument that this marriage does not meet the entail's requirements regarding suitable standing. The table fell silent. Eleanor's face had gone pale, though her spine remained straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite whatever storm must have been moving through her at the mention of a grandfather she likely knew little about. "My grandfather's misfortunes," Eleanor said finally, her voice steady, "occurred before my mother was even born, Mr. Farrow. I fail to see how a man's poverty, suffered decades before my own existence, reflects poorly on my moral standing today." "The entail does not concern itself with fairness, Miss Marsh," Farrow said, not unkindly, though the words landed like a blow regardless. "Only with the letter of the law as written by the previous Duke." "Then let us examine the letter of the law more closely," Constance said, and something in her tone made every head at the table turn toward her. "Bring me the original document, Mr. Farrow. I signed it myself, many years ago, as witness to my late husband's wishes, and I remember its contents rather better than you appear to." Farrow's confidence flickered for the first time since he had entered the room. He produced the document, and Constance read through it slowly, her finger tracing each clause with deliberate care, while Gerald watched from across the table with an expression that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shift from confidence toward unease. "Here," Constance said finally, tapping a clause near the bottom of the second page, "the entail requires that a marriage not bring disrepute upon the family through the conduct of the bride herself. It says nothing whatsoever about the conduct of ancestors 3 generations removed. If it did, Gerald, I suspect a great many families in this county, including your own mother's, would find themselves rather uncomfortably exposed." Gerald's mouth tightened. "That is a matter of interpretation, Aunt." "It is a matter of plain reading," Constance said, "and I would remind you, Mr. Farrow, that I remain the surviving witness to this document's original intent, a fact that carries some weight in any court that might eventually hear this matter, should you be foolish enough to pursue it that far." The dinner ended shortly after, Farrow gathering his documents with considerably less theatrical flourish than he had produced them, and Gerald excusing himself with a stiff bow that fooled no one into believing the matter was settled. Alden walked Eleanor to the garden afterward, the cool evening air a welcome relief after the tension of the dining room. "I am sorry," he said. "You should not have had to sit through that." "I am not made of glass, Alden," Eleanor said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the title attached, a small thing that landed in his chest with surprising weight. "I have faced worse than a lawyer with a leather case. What concerns me is not Gerald's tactics tonight, but what he might attempt next, now that this approach has failed him." "He will find something else," Alden admitted. "He always does." "Then we will meet it when it comes," Eleanor said, "together, rather than you carrying it alone as you have carried everything else in this family for 10 years. Alden looked at her in the fading evening light, at the steady, unshaken set of her shoulders, and understood, with a certainty that settled deep and did not waver, that whatever Gerald attempted next, whatever legal technicality or manufactured scandal he dredged up from some forgotten corner of the family's history, it would not be enough to separate him from the one person who had ever looked at Ashcombe's troubles and offered to share them rather than exploit them. He did not yet know how close Gerald would come to succeeding, nor how much it would cost his mother to see the fight through to its end. The rumor reached Ashcombe before Alden did, carried by a stable boy who had heard it from a delivery man, who had heard it from someone in the village market, the way such things always traveled, faster than truth and twice as eager to be believed. By the time Alden returned from a morning spent reviewing tenant accounts, Mrs. Higgins met him at the door with a face drawn tight with worry. "There is talk in the village, Your Grace," she said. "Ugly talk. Someone is saying Miss Marsh was engaged to a curate in her own parish before she ever met you, and that the engagement was broken under scandalous circumstances. They are saying she left her home county, not for love, but to escape the shame of it." Alden's stomach turned cold. "That is a lie." "I do not doubt it, Your Grace," Mrs. Higgins said, "but a lie spoken loudly enough, and often enough, has a way of becoming truth in the minds of people who were never inclined to think well of a duke, marrying beneath his station in the first place. He found Eleanor in the small garden where he had first spoken to her at Ashcombe, standing very still among the herb beds, a letter clutched in one hand, her face pale in a way that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with fury barely contained. "You've heard it, then," she said without turning. "I've heard it," Alden confirmed. "It isn't true." "Of course it isn't true," Eleanor said, finally turning to face him, and the anger in her voice was sharp enough to cut. "There was no curate. There was no broken engagement. There was no scandal, because I have spent my entire life being far too busy tending to a parish to have time for the kind of foolishness this rumor describes. But it does not matter whether it is true, does it? It only matters whether enough people choose to believe it." "Gerald," Alden said, the name coming out like something bitter. "I assume so," Eleanor said, "though I cannot prove it, and neither, I suspect, can you, which is precisely why he chose this particular weapon instead of another lawyer with another leather case. A rumor cannot be argued away with a clause from an old document." Alden felt the old, familiar helplessness rising in him, the sense of fighting an enemy who never showed his hand directly, who struck from shadows and left no mark that could be traced back to him with any certainty. But beneath the helplessness, something else was rising too, something sharper and more determined, born from watching Eleanor stand in that garden with her spine straight, despite the poison someone had thrown at her name. "Then we will not fight a rumor with silence," Alden said. "We will fight it with the truth, spoken loudly enough and by enough people who actually know you, that no whispered lie can survive against it." They rode back to Eleanor's home county the following morning, a journey made faster and rougher than the one Alden had taken weeks earlier, both of them anxious to reach Reverend Marsh before the rumor could travel there ahead of them and cause any lasting damage among the families who trusted him. The road narrowed as it wound through a stretch of forest close to the county border, the trees pressing close on either side, and it was there, in the deepest shadow of the woods, that the carriage came to a sudden, violent stop, the horses screaming and rearing as two men stepped into the road ahead, one holding the reins of a horse blocking their path, the other approaching the carriage door with a grim, purposeful stride. "Stay inside," Alden said to Eleanor, his voice low and hard, already reaching for the door. "I will not," Eleanor said, already moving beside him. "I did not survive 12 years of running a household alone to sit quietly while strangers threaten my life on a public road." The man at the door did not draw a weapon, though his hand rested meaningfully near his coat as he spoke. "A message," he said, "from someone who thinks the lady would be wiser to return to her own county and remain there, rather than continuing on toward a marriage that does not suit her station." "Tell whoever sent you," Alden said, stepping between the man and Eleanor with a fury he rarely allowed himself to show, "that threatening a carriage on a public road is a hanging offense, and that I will see him personally answer for it in front of a magistrate if so much as one more word of threat reaches either of us again." The man's confidence flickered, clearly having expected less resistance from a duke unused to physical confrontation, and in that flicker of hesitation, Edmund, who had been driving the carriage, brought the handle of his whip down hard across the wrist of the man holding the horse, freeing the reins with a sharp crack that sent both intruders scrambling back into the tree line rather than risk further injury for whatever payment they had been promised. The carriage lurched forward again within minutes, Edmund driving faster than caution strictly allowed, and it was not until they had put several miles of clear road behind them that Eleanor finally let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the horses first screamed. "He is more dangerous than I realized," she said quietly. "He has always been dangerous," Alden said. "I simply never realized how far he was willing to go until now." He reached for her hand, finding it trembling slightly, despite the steady, unshaken voice she had used with the men on the road. "I am sorry. I should have taken a different route. I should have anticipated this." "You could not have anticipated everything," Eleanor said, "and I would rather face danger beside you than sit safely at Ashcombe wondering what was happening to you instead. Do not apologize for a risk we chose to face together." They reached the vicarage by nightfall, and Reverend Marsh, upon hearing both the rumor and the ambush on the road, rose from his chair with an anger Alden had not previously seen in the gentle, patient man. "I will write to every family in this parish myself," the vicar said. "I will tell them plainly that my daughter was never engaged to any curate, that the story is a fabrication designed to wound her reputation for someone else's political gain, and I will remind them, as their vicar, that bearing false witness against a neighbor is a sin no less serious for being whispered rather than shouted." The letters went out within 2 days, carried to every household in the parish, and the truth, spoken plainly by a man the community had trusted for over 20 years, began slowly to unravel the rumor Gerald had so carefully planted. It did not disappear entirely, the way such things never fully disappear once released into the world, but it lost enough of its force that by the time Alden and Eleanor returned to Ashcombe, the whispers had quieted to something more like curiosity than condemnation. Constance, when told of the ambush on the road, went so pale that Alden feared for a moment that the shock alone might do what her weakened heart had so far resisted. "He sent men to threaten you," she said, her voice shaking with an anger that seemed to cost her more strength than she had left to spare. "My own nephew, sending armed men against the woman I have chosen to welcome into this family." "We are safe, Mother," Alden said, kneeling beside her chair. "Both of us. Please, do not distress yourself over what did not happen." "It is precisely what did not happen that distresses me," Constance said, "because it means he is willing to attempt worse, should this fail to discourage you, and I fear I may not have the strength left to see this fight through to its proper end." That night, for the first time since Alden's return from the 3 counties, his mother's condition worsened sharply, her breathing growing labored in a way that sent the household into a flurry of hushed, frightened activity. Doctors summoned in the dark, candles lit in every room along the corridor to her bedchamber. Alden sat beside her bed until dawn, holding her hand, while Eleanor moved quietly between the kitchen and the sick room, preparing warm compresses and gentle broths with the same calm, practiced competence she had once brought to tending her own parish's sick and dying. By morning, Constance had stabilized, though the doctor's face carried a gravity that told Alden more than his careful words did. Time, which had already felt scarce, now felt like something slipping through his fingers far faster than he was prepared for. "We cannot wait for a proper courtship, nor for Gerald to run out of schemes on his own timeline," Alden said to Eleanor, as they stood together in the corridor outside his mother's room, both of them exhausted, both of them frightened in ways neither wanted to name aloud. "If my mother is to see this marriage before she loses the chance to see anything at all, we must move quickly, whatever society may say about haste." "Then we will move quickly," Eleanor said, without a moment's hesitation. "I did not come this far, through rumors and ambushes and armed men on a forest road, to lose you now to nothing more than the ordinary passage of time. Speak to your mother, speak to my father. Let us not waste another day waiting for a more convenient moment that may never come." Alden looked at her, exhausted and unshaken in equal measure, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled since the candle first went out beside his mother's bed weeks earlier. Whatever Gerald attempted next, whatever final desperate move remained in his arsenal of threats and rumors, Alden understood, with a certainty as solid as the stone walls of Ashcombe itself, that he would face it with Eleanor beside him, rather than in place of her, and that this, more than any title or entail, or ancient family document, was the truest measure of the equal his mother had asked him to find. The banns were read within the week, Reverend Marsh insisting on performing the ceremony himself despite the shorter notice than tradition preferred, and word of the swift wedding spread through both counties nearly as quickly as Gerald's fabricated rumor had spread weeks earlier, though this time the truth needed no defending. A duke marrying in haste to grant his dying mother's wish carried its own kind of undeniable honesty, one that even the most gossip-hungry corners of society found difficult to twist into scandal. Gerald arrived at Ashcombe 2 days before the wedding, uninvited as always, though this time his easy confidence had been replaced by something tighter, more desperate, a man watching his last real hope of inheritance slip away with each passing hour. "You cannot simply rush a wedding to avoid proper scrutiny," he said, finding Alden alone in the study late in the evening, going over the final estate papers that would need signing before the ceremony. "The entail requires proper witnesses, proper documentation. I intend to be present at the ceremony myself, to ensure every clause is observed to the letter." "You are welcome to attend," Alden said, without looking up from his papers, "though I would remind you that your presence has done this family no favors in recent weeks, and I would advise considerable caution in whatever you intend to attempt while you are here." "I intend nothing but to see justice done," Gerald said, though the words carried none of the smooth confidence they once had. "You cannot expect me to simply stand aside while a fortune I have spent my whole life expecting slips away because a vicar's daughter caught your eye on a muddy road." Alden finally looked up, setting down his pen with deliberate care. "You have sent lawyers, Gerald. You have spread lies about a woman who has done nothing to deserve them. You have sent armed men to threaten a carriage on a public road, an act that could see you hanged if I chose to pursue it through proper legal channels rather than simply asking you to leave my house. I have shown you more patience than any of that deserved, out of respect for whatever blood we still share. That patience is nearly gone." Gerald's face went white, the accusation landing with a force that suggested he had not expected Alden to know quite so much, or to speak of it quite so plainly. "You cannot prove the men on the road were mine." "No," Alden agreed, "I cannot. But I do not need proof to know the truth, Gerald, and neither do you. I suggest you spend the remaining days before my wedding considering very carefully what kind of future you wish to build for yourself, because it will not be built on the ruins of mine." Gerald left the study without another word, and for 2 days an uneasy quiet settled over Ashcombe, the household preparing for a wedding while watching, always watching, for whatever final move Gerald might still attempt. It came on the morning of the ceremony itself, in the small chapel at Ashcombe where Constance had insisted on being carried despite the doctor's protests, wrapped in blankets and propped in a chair near the front pew, determined to see her son married with her own eyes rather than trust a second-hand account delivered after the fact. Reverend Marsh stood ready at the altar, Eleanor beside Alden in a simple dress that suited her far better than any elaborate gown could have, and the small gathering of household staff and a handful of Eleanor's parish friends who had traveled to witness the ceremony filled the modest chapel with a warmth that no grand cathedral could have matched. Gerald appeared in the doorway just as the ceremony began, flanked by Mr. Farrow, both men carrying the particular urgency of people who believed they still held a winning card. "Forgive the interruption," Gerald said, his voice carrying through the small chapel with theatrical clarity, "but I must formally object to this marriage proceeding, on the grounds that the bride's family history renders her unsuitable under the terms of the entail, terms which I have now had properly reviewed by counsel in London." A murmur rippled through the small gathering, and Alden felt Eleanor's hand tighten in his own, though her expression remained steady, unshaken, the same calm determination she had shown facing armed men on a forest road weeks earlier. "We have already addressed this objection," Alden said, his voice hard. "My mother read the entail herself and found nothing in its terms that supports your claim. Your mother's memory of a document signed decades ago is hardly conclusive," Farrow said, stepping forward with his ever-present leather case. "I have brought a certified copy of the original entail, along with a legal opinion from counsel in London, confirming that the clause regarding suitable standing may indeed be interpreted to include family history extending beyond the bride herself." Constance, from her chair near the altar, made a small, sharp sound, something between a laugh and a cough, and every head in the chapel turned toward her. "Bring me this certified copy," she said, her voice weaker than it had been days earlier, but no less commanding for it. "I would like to see precisely what London Council has decided about a document I signed with my own hand before any of you were old enough to read it." Farrow, clearly unsettled by the request, but unable to refuse the Dowager Duchess directly, crossed the chapel and placed the document in Constance's trembling hands. She read through it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she traced each line, while the entire chapel held its breath around her. "This is not the original entail," Constance said finally, looking up with an expression of triumphant, exhausted satisfaction. "This is a copy altered in one crucial respect. The original clause reads that a marriage must not bring disrepute through the conduct of the person entering into it. This copy has been amended to remove the words through the conduct of the person entering into it, leaving only the broader, more dangerous phrase about family history in general. I signed the original. I know its exact wording, because I fought against a similarly broad interpretation being applied to my own marriage many years ago, and I insisted those very words be added to protect against precisely this kind of manipulation." Soquate. The chapel fell utterly silent. Pharaoh's face had gone pale, and Gerald, for the first time since Alden had known him, appeared to have no ready response at all. "Someone altered this document," Constance continued, her voice gaining strength from the sheer force of vindication. "And I suspect, Gerald, that someone was either you or counsel acting on your very specific instructions. Forging or altering a legal document tied to a peerage is not a matter for whispered rumors or veiled threats. It is a criminal matter, one I would be well within my rights to bring before the proper authorities, and I promise you, nephew, I have both the strength and the inclination left to do precisely that, should you continue this foolishness for even one more moment." Gerald's composure finally cracked entirely, the mask of easy confidence dropping away to reveal something smaller and more frightened underneath it. "Aunt, I only meant to protect the family's interests. I never intended—" "You intended precisely what you have always intended," Constance said. "To take for yourself what was never meant to be yours. I loved your father once, Gerald, before ambition hollowed him out from the inside, and I have watched the same hollowing happen to you over these past years, with a sadness I have never properly expressed. But sadness has its limits, and you have exhausted mine entirely this morning. Leave my son's wedding, and consider yourself fortunate that I do not have you removed by force and handed directly to a magistrate instead." Gerald left the chapel without another word, Pharaoh gathering his forged document with hands that shook visibly, and the small gathering watched them go in a silence that slowly, gradually, began to soften back into the warmth the ceremony had held before the interruption. "Now," Constance said, settling back into her chair with a tired but genuine smile, "where were we, Reverend Marsh? I believe my son was about to be married, and I find I have very little patience left for further delays." The ceremony continued, and this time nothing interrupted it. Reverend Marsh spoke the familiar words with a warmth that came from performing this particular ceremony for his own daughter, and Eleanor and Alden exchanged vows in a chapel filled with people who had watched them fight for this moment, through rumors and threats and forged documents, none of which had proven strong enough to separate them in the end. When the ceremony concluded, and Alden turned to face the small gathering with Eleanor's hand in his own, he found his mother's eyes fixed on them both with an expression of such complete, exhausted peace that he felt his own throat tighten with an emotion too large for words. "You found her," Constance said quietly, as Alden knelt beside her chair afterward, Eleanor's hand still in his. "Not someone equal in rank, as I foolishly thought I meant when I first sent you off with that ridiculous list. Someone equal in spirit, which matters a great deal more, and which I should have understood from the very beginning. Thank you for sending me to find her," Alden said, "even if I did not understand, at the time, what I was truly looking for." "You would have found her regardless," Constance said. "I merely gave you a reason to look with proper urgency, rather than continuing to hide behind ledgers and estate business for another 10 years. She reached out and took Eleanor's free hand in her own thin, frail fingers. "Take care of my son, Eleanor. He has spent so long holding this family together alone that I fear he has forgotten how to let anyone help him carry the weight." "I intend to remind him often," Eleanor said, and Constance laughed, a small, genuine sound that seemed to ease something in her chest, some tension she had been carrying since the candle first went out weeks earlier. Constance lived 3 more weeks after the wedding, weeks she spent teaching Eleanor the particular history of Ashcombe, the stories behind the portraits lining the long gallery, the small habits and preferences of tenants she had known for decades, passing along not just knowledge, but a kind of quiet trust that Alden watched grow between the two women with a gratitude too deep to properly express. She died peacefully in her sleep on a mild autumn evening, with Alden holding one hand and Eleanor holding the other, and her last words, spoken so softly that Alden had to lean close to hear them, were simply, "I found my equal in watching you find yours." Gerald never returned to Ashcombe. The attempted forgery, once reported to the proper authorities as Constance had promised, cost him what remained of his standing among the family's connections, and he retreated to whatever diminished life his schemes had left him, a cautionary figure spoken of quietly in the county rather than a genuine threat any longer. Alden and Eleanor spent the years that followed rebuilding Ashcombe not into the grand, glittering estate it had once pretended to be, but into something steadier and more honest, a house that cared for its tenants the way Eleanor had once cared for her father's parish, with practical competence rather than empty performance. Reverend Marsh visited often, delighted to see his daughter thriving in a role she had never sought, but had grown to fill with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else in her life. And when people in the county spoke of the Duke of Ashcombe's marriage, they no longer spoke of rank or fortune or the strange, hasty circumstances of the wedding itself. They spoke instead of a duke who had traveled 3 counties searching for someone his equal and found her not among the names on any list, but on a muddy road beside a broken carriage wheel, in the steady hands of a woman who had never once needed a title to know her own worth.